One of the aims of the landscape photographer is to create a timeless image evoking a scene that does not date. That is easy with a rural view, but almost impossible for a town or village. The landscape photographer strives for a composition devoid of furniture. That is, something like a car. Even people can date an image to create a view that is eternal. Even television aerials on a stunningly preserved building can spoil that illusion. But at least we can get rid of them, and yellow lines in a road in Photoshop. On the other hand, if that something is of vintage quality, such as a perfectly preserved steam train or a classic car, provided the rest of the image reflects its age, not giving the game away, the photograph creates the illusion of having been taken decades ago, particularly if a sepia tint is added by a 21st century computer, making the fantasy complete. Music too helps, especially works by 19th and 20th century English composers, Elgar, Vaughan Williams, Delius, and Holst, to name a few. They were composed in an era that we hark back to with wistfulness and longing, recalling how things used to be. Frank Bridge lived on the South Downs near Seven Sisters, and two of his compositions, The Sea and Enter Spring, conjure up the pulsating atmosphere of the area, an exhilarating walk on the downs on a windy day that can still be enjoyed today. An illustrator of that period was Brian Cook. Around the 1930s, he produced a series of paintings for the publishers Batsford that today conjure up an age full of nostalgia. His use of colour in great slabs may raise a few eyebrows today, but they reflect that half-forgotten vision of Britain, like the music of this period when everything looked right, even though they were created between two world wars. I don't wish to appear a romantic, but in my own era, a means of escapism has become increasingly important. As a producer searching for idealistic images that are real and merging them into a production that is a distraction from the current world, I present my vision as an entertainment, if only for a few minutes. For the photographer, the stereotype image is the village, particularly where the owner of a period building has been conscious of its history. Whilst the exterior might reflect its past, in many cases its interior is more recent. At Higher Bockhampton in Dorset, not far from Dorchester, both exterior and interior are preserved to something close to their original appearance, because this is Hardy's cottage, the birthplace of the novelist and poet Thomas Hardy. The cottage borders Puddletown Forest, inspiration for Egdon Heath in The Return of the Native. My visit was on a beautiful sunny day. It was possibly not the best weather for evoking the atmosphere of the novel, especially its opening pages. It is quite likely that there weren't so many trees either in Hardy's time. The Return of the Native, and in particular Puddletown Forest, his Egdon Heath in the novel, are brought to life in an orchestral tone poem by the English composer Gustav Holst. It was not well received at its premiere, its mood dark and austere, mirroring the atmosphere of the story. Holst met Hardy at Maxgate towards the end of his life. Sadly, he did not live long enough to hear Holst's sombre composition, not always easy on the ear, but evokes the mood of many of Hardy's novels, all set in the Dorset landscape that was his Wessex. Controversially, Hardy's heart is buried beside his two wives at St. Michael's Church, Stinsford, but his body was interred at Westminster Abbey. Several composers were inspired by places, sometimes where they lived. Eric Coates' Sleepy Lagoon was the view at dusk from East Selsey to Bognor Regis, whereas John Ireland, who lived in a converted windmill at Washington, was haunted by the South Downs. Sir Edward Elgar, wishing to escape from wartime London, rented a cottage in Sussex, on the edge of remote woodland at Fittleworth near Pulborough. Brinkwell's, as the house was called, and its surroundings inspired his chamber works, including the piano quintet, evoking the mysteries of the area. Very few towns are named after famous people, but Telford in Shropshire is one, and as recently as the 20th century. Thomas Telford was an engineer who helped to build Britain, and his many triumphs include canals, bridges, and roads. The bridge spanning the Menai Straits in North Wales is an iconic structure, but an unsung hero of his engineering feats is the road itself that crosses his Menai Bridge, but further back in the heart of Snowdonia. With gradients not exceeding 1 in 20, his road, now the modern A5, weaves its way around Driven and the Glidders, offering the motorists and previously the stagecoach traveller some of the most breathtaking vistas in North Wales. The Welsh section commences at Chirk. Here, a cast iron aqueduct, also designed by Telford, crosses the Ceiriog Valley, taking the Llangollen Canal from England into Wales. After Llangollen, the road follows a railway to Corwen that used to cross Snowdonia, but on a more southerly route to Barmouth on the Cambrian coast. At Berwyn, both road and rail are accompanied by the River Dee, which wends its way unobtrusively deep in the valley below. Turner made several tours of North Wales before Telford improved the road network. Consequently, his paintings are of places on the perimeter of Snowdonia, principally the castles, with only Dolbaden requiring an excursion into its heartland. What a shame he missed out on the Menai Bridge. As far as I can ascertain, it does not feature in his work as it was not completed until 1826, 27 years after Turner's last tour of North Wales. Turner travelled widely, and some of his most memorable paintings that resulted from a South Wales tour are of Tintern Abbey on the banks of the River Wye. They are certainly early works and show incredible detail, quite different to his later creations. Based on pencil sketches, they were worked on in the winter after the tour and completed the following year. Tintern Abbey is in the care of Cadw and set apart from the village. It has its own special atmosphere. That is, if you can choose a time when not too many people are visiting. I think the winter light may have helped my photographic visit in capturing that mood. It is a tragic and devastating irony that Wainwright's later work was affected by failing eyesight. His best work is set around his true home, the Lake District, first entering the public domain with his 7 guidebooks to the Lakeland Fells, published in the 1950s and 60s. They are all hand-drawn, and his attention to detail is a miracle in itself, and surprisingly still accurate today. Wainwright has unfairly been accused of causing erosion on the Lakeland Fells, but it should be remembered that maps published shortly after the Second World War were not entirely accurate when showing footpaths. That was Wainwright's original inspiration, and he had no idea at all how popular his guidebooks would become, assuming that Volume 1, The Eastern Fells, would simply languish on a bookseller's shelf, gathering dust. However, whether the Lake District's popularity was caused by Wainwright or something else, it is still possible to escape the hordes. A few years ago, I walked from Grasmere up Far Easdale to Sergeant Man and hardly met a soul. On the other hand, my descent was to Great Langdale, not far from its famous pikes, and that, believe you me, was quite different. George VI said that the history of York was the history of England. It is a medieval city built over a Roman one, originally built on a flat plain where the River Ouse meets the Foss. But it is the Vikings who captured the city in 866, to whom we owe the name of York, which they called Jorvik. Not much can be witnessed of the Romans or Vikings' occupation, but the Normans, they built a castle in 1068 on a mound where Clifford's Tower now stands to suppress a revolt. After mixed fortunes, Clifford's Tower is first recorded in 1251, then known as King's Tower, the later name coming into use not until the 16th century, possibly referring to the Clifford family, constables of the castle, or the hanging of Sir Roger Clifford in 1322. Most of the castle buildings were swept away in the 18th and 19th centuries to make way for a new prison and court, leaving Clifford's Tower an isolated relic, now in the care of English Heritage. There are many steps to the entrance and even more to its top, where the fearless explorer can enjoy great views over the city. Prominent in view is the Minster. Begun in 1220, it took over 250 years to build and is the largest medieval Gothic church in northern Europe. It was not the first church on the site. One of its many treasures, its chief glory, and one that is widely recognized, is the medieval stained glass, regarded as one of the wonders of the world. A wonder of the 14th century is the great west window, known as the Heart of Yorkshire, on account of its magnificent decorated tracery, part of which resembles a heart. It was built in 1338 and 9 at a time when larger windows became the fashion, creating a sense of astonishment and marvel. The bottom row depicts bishops and archbishops of York, rising through portrayals of the life of Christ and finally into heaven. The walls that encircle York were built during the 13th and 14th centuries, but walls have surrounded the city since Roman times. They can be walked almost in their entirety and are interspersed by gateways or bars at regular intervals. Their mood perhaps can be appreciated best at sunset, and York city centre is a fascinating place to explore at night. York is also a railway town, housing the National Railway Museum, the largest of its type in the world. York is also a major working railway hub. Its Grand Station, designed by Thomas Prosser, was built in 1877 and today still exhibits much of its original architecture. Of special interest is the overall design, created on a huge curve, its roof of cast iron rafters supported on slender Corinthian columns, all of which have been adapted successfully for today's high-speed trains. One of the nostalgic delights of rail travel in the 50s and 60s were framed prints of British scenes displayed under the luggage rack, which can still be seen today on heritage railways. For those of us fortunate enough to be proud owners of a bus pass or senior rail card, we remember with affection these train journeys, then British Rail, where we gazed longingly across the compartment at places depicted as paintings below the luggage rack. They were often commissioned by the separate rail companies prior to nationalisation in 1948, and featured renowned watercolour artists of the day that included Roland Hilder, Frank Sherwin and Claude Buckle. Overall, their more subtle style could not be more different than Brian Cook's bold, brash hues, but both served a similar purpose, encouraging us to get out and see these places for ourselves, such as Ben Nevis from Corbhack. As a photographer, I am following in their footsteps, taking images of Britain's landscapes and architecture and finding a market for them in publications. Already I have used music for the interludes in this program, providing the third dimension and very hopefully arousing certain emotions. Therefore, I cannot think of a more fitting way to conclude this program with my vision of Britain.